Hello, everyone, and welcome to another installment of City Lights Live, the online iteration of the City Lights Booksellers and Publishers events calendar. I'm your host, Peter Maravellis. As always, we are beaming to you from the unceded ancestral homeland of the Ramaytush peoples, also known as the San Francisco Bay Area. It is always a privilege and an honor to be able to do so. Tonight, City Lights, together with Duke University Press, celebrate the publication of Curating Deviance, Programming the Queer Film Canon. We are delighted to have with us its author, Marc Francis. He'll be in conversation with Jesse Ataide. Curating Deviance takes a deep dive into how repertory and art cinemas between the late 60s and late 80s generated a rich and creative range of curation around queer cinema. Programmers brought to the public eye a wide range of important works featuring the films of John Waters, Pasolini, Fassbinder, amongst many others. These programs explored stigmatized practices often overlooked by LGBT-focused queer theory. Curating Deviance performs a close reading of art house cultural history, moving beyond nostalgia and reframing the narrative of imaginative curators and programmers who transform the art house calendar in innovative ways. Curating Deviance is a well-researched and welcome addition to queer film studies. Marc Francis is manager of film programming and Faculty of Arts and Sciences at Yale University and has worked at HBO, Warner Brothers, and Paramount. He's been joined tonight in conversation by Jesse Ataide, the creator of Queer Modernism's website. We'll be posting links in the chat function of your Zoom dashboard with which you'll be able to purchase copies of Curating Deviance. And we'll also have time for your questions at the end, so please post them in that same chat function from where we will retrieve them. So please join us now in offering a warm welcome to Marc Francis and Jesse Ataide. It is a pleasure having you both with us. Welcome to City Lights.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Peter, for organizing this virtual event, to all the staff, of course, at City Lights. Thank you to Jesse for agreeing to serve as respondent. I'm a huge fan of his Queer Modernism's IG account. I feel like this book aligns perfectly with the account's ethos and aesthetics. And given that Jesse is a longtime San Francisco local and a cinephile himself, it just made total sense to ask him to join. This is my first official book event ever about in general and with this book. So it's a bona fide launch. I'm thrilled. I'm also terrified, but mostly I'm just excited to have this book out in the world and hear people's responses to it. So I'll start by saying that I've been describing this book to people for so long in rather technical scholarly terms. And I've been describing it for nearly 10 years now since I finished the dissertation version of it. And I typically say it is a book that looks at how canonical queer films were programmed or curated in US urban repertory and art house cinemas in the from the 70s to the 80s. From 1968 to 1989 specifically. But because I've been describing it in such starkly historical terms for so long, I've only recently started to reflect on where the project came from and where it emerged from within me. So this is where I want to start today, to say just a few words about the personal dimensions of the project. And then I think we can work our way towards the more kind of academic, argumentative thrust of the book. So while this project is very much grounded in the historical record, and thank you, Peter, for your wonderful summary of the book, so eloquently put. So this project is very much based in the historical record, and it became a way for me to think, but I think it became a way for me to think through my encounter over the years with cinema as a site of, to put it in Freudian terms, polymorphous perversity, to understand how the moving image shaped my politics and ethics, and perhaps aspects of my psyche and libido too. This approach follows in a long tradition of queer and feminist work, or even just cultural studies more broadly, to use cultural objects or cultural history to theorize one's subjectivity, or that of a collective experience of the community, for instance. And so as a preteen here, as a preteen teen, watching films from the 1960s and 1970s, such as Rocky Horror Picture Show, Harold and Maude, Beyond the Valley of the Dolls, Cabaret. I saw these films probably way too early in my life. Films by John Waters, Bernardo Bertolucci. I'm not sure if you can see all of them. I might be blocking them, but I'll try and move around a bit. And as I got older, being introduced to Pasolini's films, such as Teorema, totally transformative, Portrait of Jason, Funeral Parade of Roses, an incredible Japanese film from the late 60s, Ken Russell's films. These are all films I discuss in the book. I think on a personal register, Curating Deviance sought ways to account for how all these texts live inside of me collectively within a patchwork or intertextual logic. And I don't mean that in some kind of autobiographical sense. I'm not writing a kind of chronicle of my experiences watching these films, but as a one that exists as a kind of inheritance of a history of manifold representations of sexuality and gender on screen. And so the book really sought to kind of robustly theorize a different model of queerness that I had encountered and that kind of again lived inside of me and that I was thinking through by way of the historical programming, film programming, and spectatorship. So on these entangled genealogies of cinema, sexuality, and gender, I write in the intro. Curating Deviance looks back at how, between the years of 1968 and 1989, then canonical queer films were programmed or curated at the U.S. and art house and repertory cinema. Programming, the practice of selecting and grouping films to be exhibited for a specific venue and expected audience, assembles disparate texts into a network of interrelations, what I refer to as intertextuality. By way of archival research, which I think we'll be talking about a bunch about, in which I studied calendars, listings, and program notes and interviews with living programmers from those years, I argue that post-68 film programming marshaled together what had been deemed deviant subjectivities, animating insatiable publics who hungered for non-normative perspectives on gender and sexuality. And so just to unpack that slightly, the book is really saying something about the collective experience of a generation who instituted major social change starting in the late 1960s, right? What we think about as the sexual liberation or sexual revolution. And the way that cinema also both fed that imagination and reflected that change. But similarly, it also attempts to chart a new method, the book, for the cultural historian, theorist, or scholar. So speaking about the archive I was working with, which again, I'll talk about in greater depth, and which I'll just say quickly, I don't know which side it's on, but that's an image from one of the archives I was working at, MoMA, from the Bleecker Street Cinema in New York, which is no longer there. And also there's images in that calendar on the cover of the book. But I say, I use actually BAM PFA's programmer Kathy Garrett's in something that she said in a webinar. She noted, nobody comes to every screening. So the programmer is making connections for history for when people go back and look at the programs. I love that she said this. Garrett suggests that even without total consistent attendance, the film program maps the conscious and unconscious life of a given historical moment. The film calendar is a compendium of assorted desires, fantasies, hopes, questions, curiosities, grievances, propositions, and provocations that structure and chronicle the public's complex emotional and public life. More than a mere reflection, programs and calendars provide the building blocks for unmaking and remaking the world through the public fantasy that is cinema. So the book attempts to do three interrelated things, just a modest three. First, it puts films that we might consider today part of the queer canon back in their historical viewing context, right? Anchors them in the kind of material history. But it also augments that canon that we think of today. And we're going to talk about canons, I'm sure, but it augments that canon retroactively by better understanding which films were part of a canon that dealt with sexuality in very kind of multifarious and complicated ways. And so it augments in some ways that queer canon, and it makes us also think about why those films were part of the canon at that time, and also why some have dropped out since. The second thing is, and this is again, these are all interrelated, is to challenge the criteria for a text or a film text queerness in film studies, which tends to, as Peter mentioned, center on LGBT identity and experience. And this can take many different forms. It can be explicit in terms of representation. It can be formal. It can be encoded. It can be very, very apparent. But I wanted to bring in other types, experiences, and representations that we might consider deviant or part of a kind of larger larger queer kind of kinship, web of kinship. And so I wanted to think about sex work and intergenerational desire, interracial desire, fetishism, or what's also known in sexology as paraphilia, swinging or non-monogamy, bondage, domination, and sadomasochism, BDSM, and other kinds of fetishes. Um, and the last thing that I think that the kind of bigger claim that it wants to make is it wants to expand, if not revive, by revising the queer political imagination as one that could better build coalition or affinity through programming's intertextuality. So history kind of can spark the political imagination of the present and for the future. And I write, I insist programming is more than a practice of selecting, booking, and arranging a group of films. We tend to think of it that way, very kind of technical terms. And in the context of queer film history post 1968, it did more than expose publics, LGBT and straight, to evidence of queer existence, and maybe we'd say queer and deviant existence. Programming built deviant worlds and generated out of its dialogic structure new ethical strategies of pleasure. Pleasure is a very important word there, and we'll, I'm sure, get into that as well. And care for those belonging to lower castes of the sexual and gender hierarchy. So here's a perfect example, and I'm going to basically leave you on this, or leave you with this for my intro. So I hope you can see it there. But this is a program from the New Art Cinema, 1981, summer of 1981. It's called Outlaw Cinema. It's a series that they're doing on Thursdays. I was kind of obsessed with this calendar, this program, when I discovered it actually at the New Art in a kind of cardboard box of all their programs over the years. And I'm obsessed with it for many reasons. I think first of all, this idea of an outlaw cinema, it's not really a term or a kind of genre that had much like currency or rather circulated much at this historical moment. So I like the idea of kind of that programmers at this time were erecting temporary or provisional genres out of these kind of omnibus of texts. And I return to that idea many times in the book. So I like that first and foremost. I love the design also of the program in terms of how it positions outlaw cinema. So as you can see, most of the program has these kind of, it's on a grid, these got these orthogonal lines, and then you get to the outlaw cinema side, the Thursday, and it is just off kilter, out of like just totally disorderly boxes, right? And so I love that it kind of throws off that kind of grid, that kind of the straightness of the calendar, if you will. And then I'll also say that the term outlaw has, of course, a lot of resonance in film history with cinephiles who kind of, there was kind of machismo image of the outlaw, whether that took the guise of cowboys and westerns, or it took the guise of like gangsters, you know, the outlaw kind of fetishized masculinist image of the outlaw. And I love that this kind of reframes it by way of some really gay and queer texts. I mean, you have Divine in that category, right? You have A Year of 13 Moons, which I talk about in the book to a large extent, Fassbinder's film about a trans woman. So I love that it's kind of rethinking this term, this idea of the outlaw and who fits in that category, kind of revising it for those cinephilic audiences. And types that are included in this idea of the outlaw as this kind of umbrella term. You have sex workers, so you have Paul Morrissey's films you might be able to see there, Flesh, Trash, and Heat. All with Joe D'Alessandro, the bisexual hunk of Warhol's Factory, who kept playing these sex workers in Paul Morrissey's films. You have also taboo kinks in John Waters' films, in Pasolini's Salo, in Kenneth Anger's films. You have these kind of women behaving badly, women kind of against men in Warhol's Bad, which is a film that's very hard to actually see. Luckily, I've seen a copy of it. Or in Repulsion, for instance, with Catherine Deneuve. And then you also have transgender or trans and gender queer, gender nonconforming folks, such as, of course, Divine, but also in A Year of 13 Moons. So with this program in chapter 2, I focus mostly on the question of type and representation. And in chapters 3 and 4, I deal more with questions of kind of form and narrative interaction in intertextuality and the kind of the program the space of the program. There are plenty of Bay Area examples. They make many appearances. For instance, elsewhere in chapter 2, I discuss one Marlene Dietrich and Joseph von Sternberg retrospective that was at San Francisco's Roxy in 1988, in which I analyzed the haptic fetishism of Dietrich's costumes, or the kind of different fabrics that accompany or surround her in the frame. And I don't actually do this by way of kind of psychoanalysis, which is where we tend to go with fetish, but I actually do this by way of one of the founding texts of sexology from Victorian era, where they talk about handkerchiefs and fabrics and stuff. So this is just a way to give you a sample or taste of the book's main investments and inventions, and what kind of historical fare I examine in the process. So thank you again for joining, everyone, and I'm so eager to hear Jesse's thoughts. So I will hand it over to him.
All right. Can you hear me? Is everything good? Wonderful. So yes, so first off, thanks so much, Mark, for inviting me to do this event with you. It took me by surprise, and but it really has been such a pleasure reading it. When you explained to me what it was, it very much was, yes, this resonates with me and my own interests and work, and especially with my Instagram account, Queer Modernisms, as well. And yeah, it's just been so generative and sparked so many ideas as I've been reading through the book these last few weeks. And I found that it just made me so nostalgic. And not even, and I'm sure that's going to be the experience for a lot of other readers of this as well.
Yeah.
It's interesting for me in that I didn't even experience the time period that it was my own specific, great cinephile period. Personal cinephile period was like late 2000s through the 2010s, so much later than the period. But it has, it did inspire me to dig up a few of these, which if you can
Ah!
see, anybody, hopefully longtime Bay Area, as well will feel very nostalgic about the Castro calendars that came out, because I love seeing them throughout your book. And I loved what you were saying or explaining for the New Arts one. And it struck me while watching it, like, doesn't the grid format remind of certain apps and things that we use now, and how, a little image and a little text, and kind of a date and choose your own adventure. That really struck me as well. Or that was something that struck me looking at the different programs that you include throughout the book, which are so fascinating. And I do want to ask a little bit more about in a little bit. But yeah, it really, and then looking through these, it all of a sudden I was seeing all the different types of programming approaches and types that you were talking about. I mean, the one that I'm specifically was looking at here, it's, a 3-week thing that I went to with Leos Carax being paired with a film from the before, Richard Linklater's Before films, all the different, and how you explain these different types of ways of doing this, because it really was this idea of the promiscuous programming, I think is the term that you use. Like, that's what I was really taken with this, and that just how specifically in the periods that you covered, it just allows for all different types of films to mingle and collide in unexpected ways, and allowing audiences and individual spectators to see and consider these films in different lights. And I think you pretty persuasively demonstrate this with queer cinema, which is one of your main, but how placing these queer films or polymorphously perverse on a double film with other films that are quote unquote more respectable, high art film, and how that really, I'd never really considered before, how it allows different spectators like it is a way um, for to kind of get straight audiences in the door, and kind of
Mm.
expose them to different sexual ideas, images, different things like that, of a whole
Mhm.
range. I mean, it's queer ones, but you go over, there's so many different types of non heterosexual, orthodox sexuality in
Mhm.
that
Mhm.
way. But then at the same time, it really allows queer spectators to see films that aren't queer per se.
Mm.
Um,
Mhm.
and in that kind of rubbing together, the skin of the film, even we could say,
Mhm.
seeing suddenly something that by itself is not queer at all suddenly has these themes that are
Mhm. Mhm.
resonant queerly, in that way. And I just love that idea of, um, you explain how uh, the cinema would often take like a handful of films, and that was kind of like, we're going to do it for this season, and but
Mhm.
they're all put in different double bills, and so as audience, if they came and saw them, would see them in these constantly shifting contexts, and in all those ways. I just thought it was such a, um, yeah, such like an exciting idea, and it also just really helped, like you specifically used, one of the examples you used was Grey Gardens, which
Mhm.
is a film that it's always like, it's a queer film, like, but it's not at the same time, but in the way
Mhm.
that, this is a way that really it allowed me to start thinking in that way of when it's paired in other ways, and it takes on these different things to start thinking of that. So
Mhm. Mhm.
that was really, that's the main one that I'll do, that I was just really taken with that idea. um
Mhm. Mhm.
but yes, even though you called me the respondent for this, I left academia and I don't do that anymore. So instead of me going over what ideas that I particularly liked, yeah, I thought I'd rather hear you talk about them. So I'd much rather have a conversation about these
Absolutely.
different things. So I think I'm just going to start asking you some questions.
Please. Thank you. But thank you. That was a response and it was a lovely response. Thank you. Because I
I,
wanted to hear also like what, what resonates with you, yeah, I love that it hit a nostalgic place or kind of like, yeah, yeah. So anyway, but go ahead. Sorry.
No, 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 no. I'm glad to hear that. So,
Yeah.
yeah, I mean, I thought a good place to start was
Mhm.
specifically talking about the some of the concepts and ideas you're spotlighting on with the cover, with the title itself. Um,
Sure.
and I know the first time when I picked it up, you are specifying the queer canon, but specifically that
Yeah.
you use deviant over queer, which kind of surprised me, in a way. And so I thought maybe that's a way to, what does deviant mean to you specifically within the context, of this, and how you're thinking of that.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's maybe two questions in there about one is about how I think about queer versus deviance, maybe is one, and the other one is
Mm-hmm.
thinking about, which I think is related to this question of like what canon am I talking about, or what canons am I talking about? Which that's going to get really complicated, and I'm going to try and be as succinct as possible with that. The slightly easier question, though also messy in its own way. I mean, I'm a student of queer theory, and I watched all these films I just listed, earlier in this talk. I watched them all, or not watched them all, but I watched so many of them through the lens of what queer theory taught me, about obviously, of course, like the constructedness of gender and sexuality, and also. Thinking about the kind of plurality or multitude of different types of desire in the world. But I feel like when it came to film studies, specifically as a discipline, there was still in that kind of subfield a preoccupation, not preoccupation, but there was still a kind of I'm trying to think of words to how to phrase it. But it still tended to be a film was queer because of some relationship, again, to kind of LGBT desire or identity or experience that even with, work that was like, for instance, let's watch Wizard of Oz and say it's queer, it always was about like, well, because the witches were lesbians, and of course, like Wicked plays that up and stuff too. But I really wanted to push against that framework. And I think that deviance, when I learned about deviant studies, which comes out of sociology, of the post-war era, I was like, oh, they were interested in all these different types. And all these different types are also in like the queer film canon that I know, right? And so I thought deviance is actually a better framework for me to account for and to think through all the ways that those types are structurally linked or systemically linked to each other in the strata or the hierarchy of gender and sexuality in specifically, let's say, US culture. Um, so I think what I'm trying to get at is that while I do kind of adopt deviance as a overall framework, a theoretical framework for the book, for the reasons I just stated, I do think that so many of the lessons of queer theory are still with me, and they're still with me in my reading practices. And so I kind of am okay with sliding between the two, as much as I want to push people who do queer film studies or watch films through a queer lens, to maybe think about these other ways to watch, that might yield other kinds of politics. Okay, so that's my attempt at an easy answer to that. In terms of the question of canons, so I think if we were to ask maybe people in this room or ask like people at a gay bar or something or a queer bar, like what is the queer canon to you? Or not even a queer bar. We could ask anyone really, who has any sense of what that word means. They would generally, again, identify LGBT films, and you could go and look at all the online right lists that always come out on Pride Month in June that are like
Always,
the
always.
top queer films, right? And rarely do they include films where again it's not there's like a queer critique in it, or there's again like what I described where there's these non-normative sexualities. There rarely are those included in there unless they have something to do with again LGBT experience, identity, etc., desire, etc., embodied forms of embodiment, etc. Um, and so I wanted to say, when we look back at these programs, these calendars, and outlaw cinema is like a great example of this, right? We don't necessarily see so many of the groupings congealing around the idea of like a sexual identity. They did, some programs did, but I was, I guess, thinking that, okay, if like Kenneth Anger is being shown with like I'm trying to think of like Herschel Gordon Lewis or something like that, right? Or Russ Meyer is a better example. Pasolini's with Russ Meyer in the case of outlaw cinema, right? That is a different canon. And those films were being shown over and over again. They were absolutely canonical. People saw them over and over. They expected them at the repertory houses during those decades. So I think for me, I wanted to go, okay, those films are being put in dialogue with each other. They're being constellated together. How do we think about the political work that they're doing, if not through the kind of identitarian project or identitarian framework? So that's where I wanted to say there's a queer canon that we've like forgotten about, that we've overlooked, and that's in the historical record. And I want to go back to that, and I want to augment the criteria for how we think about the canon. So it's messy, right? And when I say the canon, it really is always multiple canons. Who's deciding on that canon? From what vantage point or perspective? It shifts with history, as I just explained. I should also make one other point before we get to your next question, or your response, which is to say, and now I've forgotten my point. Oh, that of course, and I think this is probably obvious for many people in the room, but queer as the way we understand it was not a thing it wasn't called like the queer canon those days, right? A lot of these films were just like gay films, or like perverse or like wacky films, or whatever was the euphemism that they used for it. And so, we're always retroactively, or right, kind of like naming that canon. So I just want to make a point of that. If films were called queer, it was not in that politicized sense. That queer theory didn't emerge until the 90s, and this book actually ends as new queer cinema, which was the kind of very explicit kind of like these are queer politics as we understand them in queer theory was emerging. It's that moment that I actually mark as the end of what the period is that I'm looking at. I think we got a lot
Yeah,
in there. I
absolutely.
know I rambled, but I think we got a
Yes,
lot in
I
there.
know.
Yeah,
I mean, it's only huge concepts that I was asking you to distill
that's
into
fine.
a few
That's
minutes.
fine. That's
But
fine.
yeah, no, I was I mean, and one of the things I think is how much of this ended up feeding into what we now consider the queer canon, all of these things that were going on, and it was much more unruly, and it is fascinating to
Yeah.
see what has um what established itself and became quote unquote queer canon.
Yeah.
um and because one of the interesting things early on that I think if you had asked me, going into the book, like who are these programmers or who are these the ones
Yeah.
doing it, I think it would have just been my assumption of like, oh, like queer people who want to do, like who, like the idea of a queer film festival, like wanting to do it in that way. But you
Yeah.
point out that
Right.
some of the earlier ones of this are white straight men, like Jonas
Most of them
Mekas and
were.
Amos. So,
Yeah.
yeah, and that actually they were creating a space, and it wasn't. And then later, it seems like there were a lot of specifically gay men who were being programmers of these rep theaters. But it was a really fascinating that like just that idea in and of itself of just like, oh, this was starting from a different space or
Mhm.
from different people than I would have anticipated going
Yeah.
into it, which I just thought was so interesting.
And can I just
Um,
respond to one thing you just
yeah,
said?
go
Because
for
I
it.
do think that these mostly white, straight male, cis male programmers, I think their intention in programming some of these films was, I mean, it was to capitalize, to monetize, right? I mean, that's not like
Absolutely.
they had to run
Yes.
businesses. And I do, this isn't a point I make in the book, but there is a question of if there was still some interest in, for instance, doing like a gay program, which again, some did. Bleecker Street Cinema did a big gay program in the late 70s or early 80s. They did appear that maybe there was a question for them, like, is there actually an audience for a strictly gay, like ongoing weeks long program versus like folding them in? And this is this is a big point I make in my book, where in the process of folding it in, these films become representative for or metaphors in some ways for a general anti-establishment attitude. Right? Like gayness stands
Right.
in for like and like I'm an outsider, right? And so like a nerdy straight white male cinephile, cis male cinephile could totally be like, no, I'm one of the freaks too. So there is so there's a so I don't mean to fully romanticize it. I do think that there's frictions here, there are tensions here, but I just wanted to respond and add some just kind of layers to what you which said because I agree with you in terms of that, but the intention behind it is complicated and those politics are complicated. Yeah.
Certainly. Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was one. Yeah, sexuality, queer sexuality is just one of many, any taboo that they were,
Yeah, exactly. That's
willing
right.
to,
Right.
just wanting to push the buttons,
Precisely.
anti-establishment, and that was just one within the many
Which
options.
I think has its pros and I think also has its drawbacks. Like I'm willing to see
Certainly,
that. Yeah. Yeah.
certainly. Um, so yeah, where do we want to go now?
I know I feel like I interrupted you. You were probably like leading towards a
No, 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 no,
question.
no. I have a series of questions like what direction should we head
Yeah,
in
yeah,
now?
yeah. Go ahead.
No, I mean it was one of the things that I was thinking about was, there are all of these you include all this like archival images and different things within the book itself. And it was, even for me digging in a box for these Castro ones that I dug up, but they were so, like ephemeral. I only have a few of them. I didn't think of keeping them in that way, in a way I wish I would have now. So I was curious of where is all of this, where is this held? The
Yeah.
research that you're doing.
Mhm.
I'm glad somebody thought of and thought it was important to keep all of these things.
Right. Yes.
And because they are, I mean, yeah, just even for my own life, looking at these ones, it's like, wow, but for cinema
Yeah.
history as well. So yeah, so I was wondering where your research in that way took you, and where are these
Yeah.
types of things being held?
Yeah, I'll just say I love that you said you were digging through a box, looking at your own programs. Because in some ways, I actually hope that the reader feels like in some ways they're digging through a box as well, you know?
Yeah, I love that.
But yeah, so I mean, the archives that I worked in. So let me just say that the book, I do mention briefly, I did years of archival research. I'm not. I in the footnotes you can see all the archives I went to and all the boxes I looked at. At the same time, I didn't want it to be a kind of focus of the book. I wanted the archive to to take a little bit of a backseat to kind of like the questions of, again, the political imaginary and the politics of them. But I'll just say that just like physically where I went, I mean, MoMA was really useful. They had a lot of programs. Most of theirs are cataloged, but they also had, I mean, at one point I remember, and this is like the amazingness of like my librarians. I know, Jesse, your training trait to be a librarian and archivist, where like you'll be like, oh, I'm looking for this thing, and they're like, wait, we think just a big bin just came in, and there's some stuff in there that you should look at. We haven't cataloged it
Oh
yet,
wow. Yeah.
And
Oh,
so
amazing.
then I literally I remember people in the MoMA study room were like, what the hell? Because they just like
Yeah.
wheeled out this whole huge bin for me, and they were just not cataloged, and they were programs from all over the place, and a lot actually from San Francisco International Film Festival and stuff. So MoMA was great, and I went back multiple times there. There's an amazing book by a guy named Ben Davis about repertory cinemas, and he donated his whole collection, which are these kind of clippings and calendars from these cinemas as well. Um, I went to BAM PFA. They had an extensive collection too. Theirs was very organized, and the librarians there were amazing. Where else? The New Art, as I mentioned, it was kind of anecdotal. I found I knew the director of programming there at the New Art, Mark Vallon, who's mentioned a lot in my book. Dear friend of mine, and he had told me, no, they're sitting there in a box somewhere. And so there was a lot of correspondence with the manager, and he finally let me in. And then I was just like basically poring over them all day. Um, and then the last thing I'll say, so there were these different places, and then also like Village Voice. I went to like some online also, just like looking at the scans. I mean, Google has a pretty good, actually, extensive archive of the Village Voice listings. So I found a lot that way. And the last thing I'll say is I had thought that maybe this would be a more global project. It easily could be.
Mm,
And I mean, I shouldn't say global, I should say like international. Like thinking about Europe, specifically in the United States and Canada. But so I guess the Western world. But I had actually done some research in West Berlin as well. And I found some really amazing stuff. I'd done some research in Berlin on the West Berlin cinema scene. I found some incredible stuff, some stuff that was way more perverse
mm,
and way more explicit in its politics than American stuff. It just, again, the project ended up being US focused. So those are some of the archives I went to and some of the work I did. And again, things ranged. Sometimes things were like really pristine condition. Other times things were really kind of falling apart. And that's not always the archivist's fault. It's contingent on a lot of different factors and ephemera. It's ephemera. So it's not
exactly.
necessarily going to be
Exactly.
handled with care originally anyways. And there's always a question of, what kind of ephemera is going to count. And anyway, so I don't need to talk about the anxieties of the archive, but that definitely factored into my experience.
I get it. Yes. As a working at a library, yes.
Yeah,
Currently in a library program, yes. Oh, I could talk about those things as well, but
right.
yeah, but that does, you saying originally that you were thinking it was going to have a more international scope to it.
Yeah,
One of
yeah.
the things I did want to ask you was, what are some of the things that either surprised you or changed over the process of doing this? Did you go in with a real strong idea of where this was going to go, or was
Yeah.
it that unruly as the films and the subject matter itself?
I mean, I think that when I had my initial research question at the beginning of my PhD program, it was a kind of light bulb moment, truly was like, oh, people don't really talk about film programming in its kind of everyday context, right? People talk about film programming at festivals and things, but like, what is going on with our field? And is there a thing called programming studies or or curation studies? Not really. When I was starting this research in 2013, very, very kind of scattered scholarly work on that. And now, sorry, I'm forgetting what your question was about. Oh, what surprised me.
Just so, yeah,
So I
sorry.
think at that point, I was like, well, maybe the something about the way that queer films are programmed that unlocks some of these kind of these politics that I find interesting, like these, like again, like returning to deviant studies and stuff. So I kind of had this like really strong hunch that then ended up being kind of like proven over and over again in the archive. But so that say became a little bit predictable in a sense. But I will say that like I did expect to find more examples of explicitly like not obviously stating queer, but that there would be some kind of other terms used that it was very like, I don't know, I think these days there's, you find these programs, that are like the X-rated canon, right? That like the American Cinematheque will do, or Metrograph here in New York will do. And so I guess I was expecting to see more of those. But there weren't that many explicit. It was more like I had to go into the calendar and go like, okay, what were the double bills? What was in conversation, that again it elicited a kind of queer reading or deviant reading. What was outlaw cinema ended up being like a kind of minority case. I will say also because I had done some of that research in Germany earlier, that I expected to find more examples like I did in the German context in the US, and they were harder to find. So I would
Right.
say, yeah. So I'd say, I mean, and we could talk about the way that geography and nation plays a part in that. We have West Berlin right up against East Berlin at that moment, and having a very different sexual politics of that era. So anyway, that's not the focus here, but just to say that I think that surprised me a little bit, and I don't know. Oh, and the last thing I'll say, programmers, brilliant people, have a lot of insights, know a lot about the history of the industry and the history of film aesthetics, and they're total omnivores. They're the most amazing people. But interviewing programmers, I was hoping that there'd be someone who would give me some kind of theoretical, like, ooh, that's the thing I'm missing, like who had thought about film theoretically. And actually that never happened. I mean, Kathy Garrett's talked about several things that were very kind of like rich and theoretical in that webinar, but that was like years after my research with the interviews. So I will say that like I remember that my advisor, B. Ruby Rich, when I go back to her and be like, no one is theorizing for me. And she was like, right, you have to do that. Like you have to do that work,
Yeah,
right?
that's
It's
your
like,
job.
right. I guess it's like me. Okay. So anyway, so it's just to say that yeah, it was that was I think a challenge for me in the initial kind of that initial dissertation research.
Yeah, and that's interesting you say that because it did strike me as well that you actually don't go into it the curate the process of curation and different things as well. Like you
Yeah.
don't, and that would make sense because it sounds like they're not saying like I had this vision for my my curatorial process or things like that.
No,
Um
I mean, actually, Steven Soba was the closest who had a bit of a more kind of conceptual way of thinking about not
okay.
his programming, but actually, he worked for a programmer named Fabiano Canosa, Brazilian programmer who worked in New York. I could go into specifics about it, but he had almost, it was like wonderful because he actually was like almost like an observer worked for him, was his assistant, but also an observer of Fabiano. And he kind of had like, I think he tried to figure out the psychology, kenosis psychology. And I think that was my in to understanding like, oh, like he used this word salonified. He was like, he had a very salonified approach. And I was like, that's great. And I talk about that in the book in terms of kenosis eclecticism, which was like a lot of programmers had very eclectic tastes, but again, it lent a kind of like language, vocabulary, whatever to the thing that I was trying to understand better. Yeah.
Well, okay. Maybe I'll have one more question and then we can open it up to
Love
any,
it.
hopefully, please, yes, anybody put any questions in it. Um, but yeah, since you are, in your current position, you are also a programmer as well. And I was
Yeah.
wondering just how you see these ideas that that have been put into this book, in the ways either they affect your work or how you see it within the current, more in the current, you know, cinephile cinematic landscape, of rep houses and everything. Rep houses are seem to be having a moment, and
I
they're
know.
kind of cool again. So yeah, just thought we'd end there. You kind of go into it in the afterward. You talk a little bit more of like moving from VHS and how, and then like streaming and things like that has kind of,
Mhm.
made a lot of these concepts go away or at least take very different forms. So yeah,
Yeah.
so just from like a current, as somebody who's also doing this work,
Mhm,
your
mhm.
take in that way.
Yeah, as a practitioner. Yeah. I mean, I think programming at Yale is it's a very specific context for programming.
Mm-hmm.
I think some of the richest moments in this job are when, and I think that you can kind of see this in the book, is when I'm, guiding or mentoring students and faculty through like, do you want to do a film series? Okay, like, what do you want? What is the point of the series? Like, what is the arc of the series? What is the story you're telling, right? And what kind of journey do you want to take audience members on? And maybe I mean, at Yale we have actually people who come to all the screenings in a series, so that's great, but and then for people who don't, what are the things that you really want? What are the what are the titles that people are going to recognize versus the titles that are going to also be like, what's that? I've never heard of that, obscure. And that's something that like programmers were doing in this era, right? I talk about that, like, and you mentioned it too, I think briefly, where in a double bill you might have the New Yorker Theater, and I'm blanking on his name right now terribly, but you had um, oh my God, and his wife's name is Toby. Someone will probably know in the chat. But he wrote there's a great book that came out of Columbia University Press recently, talking about his life programming. But anyway, he would do that. That was a strategy where he would pair in a double feature films that were a film that was really well known with a film that he really loved but was not well known, and that would get people
Okay.
in, right? So I think I do a lot of that, and I do a lot of that, and anyways, as a practitioner. But again, Yale's a specific context. In terms of the repertory context, I think yes, I am so inspired by repertory having a revival. I think people really want to see things on film. I think there's an excitement around that. I think seeing and feeling the texture of the print is very exciting to people. And I think that also the curational aspect of it. I think I mentioned this in my afterword. I think this is probably what you're hinting at, which is we live in this age of just such a profusion of content that is out there on streaming platforms. And that includes also the arty ones like Mubi and Criterion that offer incredible stuff, but it's too much. And they try their best to curate it, but it's still overwhelming. And I think there's something appealing to people who are like, okay, there's a human, and Criterion does have human programmers. And Mubi does too, but there is known human at that repertory house making those decisions and going, what are people on a Thursday night in the middle of winter in New York City wanting to watch, and what is the moment? What is our identity as a space? So I think of the how Metrograph, for instance, I keep bringing them up, but how they're known for, a lot of East Asian cinema. And so like people really trust them, and I think there's a lot of trust built in. So I think repertory houses, I think people gravitate to them that way. I can say a lot more, but I do think that, and I think also, sorry, the obvious point too, the collective experience, right? The actually in person, with a crowd, the affective conditions of the environment, the atmospheric and environmental conditions of the cinema as a space where we are sharing where we're sharing in that experience. We're also working sometimes at odds with each other effectively. How many times have you had someone laugh at some moment where you're like, that is not funny? Or you laugh at a moment and you're like, I don't think that was funny. Like that, it makes it it's such an inspiring and exciting thing to still experience in contrast to watching something in the solitude of your home by yourself with a friend, family, partner, whatever, but not having that kind of communal experience. Maybe that's a good place to end our conversation. So yeah.
Yeah. No,
Yeah.
I'm glad you
Yeah.
caught that because I was gonna say I do think people will want to gather together again. Like I was at the Castro last night for John Waters was
Mhm.
presenting, and it was just electric
Yeah.
because you can tell with the Castro Theater reopening, like people are just ready to be together again to watch things.
Oh my God,
Um,
yeah. And I didn't
and
talk about the
yeah,
queer stuff. Sorry to interrupt you, but I realized that in terms of where queer cinema is these days, in terms of how it's curated, I think actually the Repertory House is carrying on some of these traditions. I think that they do tend to vary. Again, the June program, we always wait for the June programs always going to come,
yes,
the LGBT program, and that and that of course the high profile queer film festivals such as New Fest and Frameline and well, it was Outfest in LA. But that there are these sites now that queer people can go to and kind of and B. Ruby Rich has talked about the Queer Film Festival or the LGBT Film Festival in terms of kind of creating an insularity around in terms of audience that I think was actually like something that I think I found really refreshing in my research that it was like everyone went to the cinema to watch all the gay shit, or the straight kinky stuff, right? That there was appeals across identities. So I think that, but I do think that there's enough effort in repertory houses to still upset some of those boundaries. And I can get more specific with it, but yeah, I think those two things exist simultaneously. The insular kind of queer audience, and then also the sharing of these objects.
I love that.
Yeah.
All right, yes, I think it would be a good time to move
Yeah, there's some
into some
questions.
audience questions. I saw a few pop up, so I will hand it over now.
Okay, so Steve says, I love the double bill as a kind of commentary, whether intentional or not, as I find often happens at places like BAMPFA that
Yeah.
don't explicitly program them. And the idea of queering something not obviously so by its bill pairing. Did the programmers discuss that kind of pairing as intentional? Are there any notable favorite double bills that surprised you in how they situated a film?
Yeah, I also love that that queer text can have a kind of contagion or infectious quality where suddenly something that doesn't seem so queer has a queer um, aspect or queer critique hidden within it. I mean, I talk about this in a double bill, which is I would say more like feminist double bill of Louis Mao's The Lovers and Agnes Varda's Happiness. But where those two films paired together, I think one film, I think Happiness is very explicitly like critical of heteropatriarchal like systems. And I think that The Lovers is not necessarily, but when you pair them together, suddenly that critique is made available to an audience member. So I'm very inspired by that. In terms of the question of intentionality, I am not so interested in it because I think that there's a lot for spectators to be able to, I think it's more about the like reading practice of the spectator and what they're able to glean from the text more so than what the programmers intended. But I don't think that they were necessarily like, we're going to generate these explicit, like, particular politics in this film. I don't even think like the pairing of The Lovers and Happiness was necessarily like, these are two films with like women protagonists who and dealing with heteronormativity. I think they literally were like, these are French films that deal with like that have like women who operate or yeah, I think they were very much more simple in the way they approached it. Doesn't mean that necessarily they didn't have some instinct that there might be something deeper there, but I don't think that necessarily led them. Maybe that's the best way I can put it. And then notable favorite double bills. I mean, I talk about so many. I just talked about The Lovers and Happiness, and I do love that one. But I also talk at length about Beyond the Valley of the Dolls and Myra Breckenridge. And I think about those as being, and I think about the double bill as what I call part of repertory time, which is this kind of immersive viewing experience. We're at the cinema for like 3 to 4 hours. And what are the modes that you're being kind of immersed in that experience. And so I think, like, for instance, with Beyond the Valley of Dolls and Myra Breckenridge, you're being immersed in a really like just topsy-turvy, carnivalesque, really kind of almost in times antisocial, queer antisocial kind of yeah, diegesis or world. And so I think that was one that I really love, and I'm hoping to actually restage in some of these related events. And then you said, considered the rise of a queer film. Was this part of the same question? Curious if I considered the rise of a queer film circuit, or if that's a separate field of research. Yeah, I touch on it a little bit in the book, but I do consider that a different project. And there is some writing on the rise of gay and lesbian or queer film festivals. And I don't really touch on those because I'm trying to kind of, as I've already kind of articulated, tried to go to a different political direction.
Another one. What do you think is at stake politically today for us to frame this kind of programming as deviant rather than queered? Do you think of this as a trans inclusive kind of move?
So there's I like hi Topiary. Topiary is a friend of mine, and my former classmate. I think that for me, and I had a preface to my book that didn't end up making it into the final version, where I talked about like why deviance now. I talk about a little bit in the Trump era, and I talk about the politics of the right at this moment, and the ways in which I think deviance can push against, obviously, the incredibly censoring, oppressive politics of the white heterosexual nationalists in our country. At the same time, I think it also pushes against, and this is where I think the question of the trans inclusive is really interesting, because I think there's some ways in which politics today, sorry, sexual politics and gender politics have become very what's the word I'm looking for? Not balkanized, but they've just become very they become just identity more identity driven, and very much taking place performed in the social media environment, that where people are saying, this is my truth, this is my experience, and I'm going to speak it on this platform, and that's it. I think that this framework of deviance is like, while there is difference within that category, of course, we have different, there's a lot of variation in that. There is still a way in which, and of course there's going to be frictions regardless, but I think there's a way in which we can think about where we need to build coalition here. We need to think about ourselves as people or subjects that have been relegated in the sexual and gender hierarchy. How do we protect each other? How do we protect even people who we don't even think right now we should be protecting, right? Those people who are stigmatized. And so I think that that's where deviance to me is really relevant still today, as a political framework. I hope that answers your question. Maybe I didn't answer in terms of film programming, but I think that that's what I'm just going to leave it there.
Another question. Could you expand on comments about Russ Meyer's exploitation films? Also, what kind of role does Cecil B. Demented play as a film in queer canon? Could you go on about the stigmatization of John Waters' films?
Yeah, so I don't know. Cecil B. Demented came out later, and I don't know enough about. I'm not a John Waters scholar per se. I'm more interested in his films from this era, from the 70s and 80s. But so I'll say I'm very interested in this question of Cecil B. Demented, but I just don't know. Russ Meyer's sexploitation films. So expand on the commentary. Well, there's a lot I can say about Russ Meyer, and there's a lot I say in the book, but I'll say one thing which I love, and this is really from Elena Gorfinkel, who wrote an amazing book called Lewd Looks. about sexploitation films in the 60s. And she talks about how Russ Meyer, and I discovered this too in my research too, my archival research around the same time I was reading Lewd Looks. But Russ Meyer was actually shown at MoMA in the late 70s. His films were shown, sorry, in the late 70s. And that was really radical for MoMA, for a museum that had been showing avant-garde films, and they had been testing the boundaries for years, but to show like a low-brow sexploitation film and to also honor a director, to kind of canonize him in a way, and say, look, there's interesting things happening formally and artistically here. That was wild, and actually Elena Gorfinkel goes into detail about different kind of audience responses where you had people who were not like who were like, oh, there's a Russ Meyer film playing down the street. Let's go. I love those films. They're so they're so sexy or they're so trashy. Definitely not the MoMA stiff crowd. And then you'd have these kind of like arty museum folks going, and so you had a real clashing there in that environment. So I love that about it. And then as for the stigmatization of John's films, I don't think his films have necessarily been stigmatized. I think I mean, while of course they're independent and they're seen as like, I mean, he would say filthy, gross, of course. I think I'm more interested in the ways in which the characters within those films, what they do with their stigma, the way that they reclaim them or own them or throw them in people's faces. I mean, the films are, again, I mean, they're real kind of, what's the word I'm looking for? Just like they honor filth and trash, right? So, yeah, okay. I think it answers that.
Let's see. I think we could have time for one more.
Yeah.
This might be more of an afterward question since you end the book at New Queer Cinema, but this talk about intertextuality got me thinking about something that had to be around in the eras you're discussing, but I'm not sure. If you go to, say, Alamo Drafthouse or in New York, the Nighthawk, some curator programmer is doing a lot of work cutting a sequence of other films that are in conversation with whatever the feature presentation is. Before the movie starts, you see all these clips, scary dolls before Megan. Did you find any evidence of that kind of practice, or is this all ephemeral?
It's funny that the next question brings up outtakes. I think the only thing that you're making me think of is this amazing gay film programmer from this era was the programmer for the Thalia Theater in cinema in New York City. His name is Richard Schwartz. And he has a very interesting biography that I won't go into, but I will just say that he, in addition to just being a brilliant programmer, was also a collector of outtakes from Hollywood films. And so he had all these like wacky outtakes of Betty Davis, and I can't remember what, I think John Wayne, and he would actually edit those together and show them before the films. And this is kind of like a little like nerdy kind of IP point, but actually there was no copyright on those. They were totally in the public domain. So he was able to show them as much as he wanted. And so he had a very kind of bricolage kind of, or he was a kind of bricoleur in a way. I talk about him as that in the book. And maybe I'm not sure if that's getting at what you're asking, but I think about that as being an interesting kind of not trailer, but a kind of like a thing, a kind of paratext alongside the feature film.
Yeah. Well, we have come to the top of the hour. There are more questions, but I'm sure people can reach you and
Yes.
continue that discussion. I really want to thank both of you for gracing our virtual halls and for someone who grew up with some really excellent repertory theaters. I mean, and was hugely influenced by their programming. This book is an absolute gem. So very grateful to you both. Marc Francis, congratulations on a wonderful, wonderful book. And Jesse, thank you for doing the honors tonight. Very grateful to you too. Also want to thank all of you who joined us. Of course, we have posted links in the chat with which you may purchase Curating Deviance. Or better yet, if you're in the hood, come on down, pay us a visit. We're located in San Francisco's historic North Beach district. We're open 7 days a week. Our hours are 10 a.m. to 10 p.m. every day. And today's event has been made possible by support from the City Lights Foundation, fostering an active engagement with books and literary culture, all dedicated to sustaining a vibrant community of readers, writers, and independent thinkers. So long, everyone. Take care. Be kind to each other. And we hope to see you all again soon.
Thank you, everyone.